December 22nd, 1978. Shakhty, Soviet Union. The temperature has dropped below freezing. The streets are gray, the buildings are gray, the sky is the color of old concrete, and what little light is left in the day is dying fast. A 9-year-old girl is walking home from school. Her name is Elena Zakotnova. She is wearing a red coat. At a bus stop not far from her route, a woman named Lana Sana watches two figures from across the road. One is the little girl in the red coat. The other is a man she has never seen before. Tall, middle-aged, large glasses, a long black coat, a shopping bag hanging from one hand. He is whispering to her. Lana watches. Something is wrong. They don't look like relatives. They don't look like they know each other. The girl isn't pulling away, but she isn't at ease either. And then Lana's streetcar arrives, and she boards it, and the two figures get smaller through the window, and then they are gone. What had caught Elena's attention, and what had made her go with him, was a simple promise. He said he could get her imported chewing gum. She was 9 years old. Of course she followed. He called it his secret house. It was a small, run-down property he had purchased near the Grushevka River. He led her inside. He locked the door behind them. In the seconds before she understood what was happening, she was already trapped. She fought. She tried to call out. She was 9 years old, and he was a grown man, and the fight did not last long. What happened in that house is something no child should ever have to experience. And when it was over, when Elena Zakotnova was gone, he carried her to the Grushevka River and placed her in the black water and watched the current take her downstream. Out of sight, gone. He walked back home. He had left the light on inside the house. He had not noticed what Elena's blood had left on the doorstep. He had forgotten both of those things, because in those moments, for the first time in his life, he felt something he had been searching for without knowing it, something he would spend the next 12 years trying to feel again. 2 days after Elena disappeared, her body was recovered from the Grushevka River. Lana Sana went to the police. She described the man she had seen, tall, middle-aged, glasses, long black coat. A sketch artist worked from her account. The image was distributed across the city. Within days, someone had been arrested. His name was Alexander Krashenko. He was 25 years old. He did not match the description. He did not wear glasses. He was not middle-aged. But he had a prior conviction for a serious violent offense. And that was enough for the Soviet police to decide they had their man. Under interrogation, he confessed. He would later retract that confession entirely, maintaining his innocence at trial. He said the confession had been forced from him. The court did not believe him. He was convicted. The sentence was escalated following pressure from the victims' families. And in July 1983, Alexander Krashenko was executed for a crime he did not commit. The real killer had watched the whole thing happen, had watched another man absorb his punishment, had felt protected by the blindness of the system around him, and so he killed again. To understand how Andrei Chikatilo killed more than 50 people across 12 years in a major metropolitan area without being caught, you first need to understand the world he was killing inside. The Soviet Union by the late 1970s was a state built on performance. The performance of order, the performance of progress, the performance of moral superiority over the capitalist West. And one of the most critical performances in that theater was this: crime in the Soviet Union was a Western problem. Serial murder was a Western pathology. predatory violence against the innocent. These were the diseases of a decadent system, not of a communist society that had elevated its citizens into something better. To acknowledge a serial killer operating in Soviet territory was to admit a fracture in the foundation. And the Soviet state did not do fractures, so information was suppressed. Investigations were kept separate. Competing bureaucracies, the militia who patrolled the streets, and the procurators who managed criminal cases, spent as much energy obstructing each other as they did pursuing any suspect. Author Robert Cullen, who covered this story as a correspondent in Moscow and later wrote a book about it, described the dynamic plainly. On paper, the division of labor looked neat enough. In practice, it was blurred. There were constant opportunities for the two agencies to get in each other's way. This was the environment into which Chikatilo hunted. It did not create him, but it protected him for 12 years. Andrei Romanovich. Chikatilo was born on October 16, 1936, in the village of Yabloknoye in what is now Ukraine. He came into the world in the immediate wake of one of history's most devastating famines, the Holodomor, caused by Stalin's forced collectivization of agriculture, which killed millions and pushed the survivors toward acts of desperate survival that left permanent psychological marks on an entire generation. Chikatilo's family were collective farm laborers living in a single-room hut, working without wages. His mother told him something when he was young. She told him that his older brother, Stepan, had been taken by neighbors during the famine, stolen, killed, and consumed by people with nothing left. The story has never been verified. It may not be true, but Chikatilo believed it. And according to the forensic psychiatrist who would later study him, Dr. Alexander Bukhanovsky, that story took root in a mind already damaged and grew in the darkness for decades. Chikatilo is also believed to have been born with a neurological condition that caused physical and developmental problems throughout his childhood and adolescence. He was deeply isolated. He refused to wear glasses despite extremely poor eyesight, afraid they would make him more of a target for the bullying he already endured. He read obsessively. He had no social life and almost no experience with others his age in any meaningful way. The shame and isolation he carried into adulthood were total, and they fed something in him that no one around him had any framework to understand or address. He served in the Soviet military between 1957 and 1960. He relocated near Rostov. His sister, concerned about his solitary life, arranged a meeting with a woman named Faina. They married in 1963. Despite everything, they had 2 children, a son and a daughter. To the outside world, he was unremarkable, a quiet, educated man living an ordinary life. He earned degrees in engineering, Russian literature, and Marxist-Leninism from Rostov Liberal Arts University. In 1971, he became a school teacher. It was here that the first visible signs of what he truly was began to emerge. He could not manage his classrooms. Students mocked him relentlessly. Complaints began to accumulate. Disturbing complaints about inappropriate conduct with children. He was moved from institution to institution. In 1974, he was dismissed from one school. He drifted. Each new placement ended in the same atmosphere of unease and allegation. At one school, he was placed in charge of the student dormitory. The boys there had no respect for him and tormented him openly. An incident occurred, serious enough that older students confronted him physically about it. He began carrying a knife for protection. None of this was formally reported to the authorities. Each institution buried the complaints to protect its own reputation. In 1978, he accepted a position at vocational school number 33 in the coal mining town of Shakhty, about 50 kilometers from Rostov. He bought a small, rundown property near the Grushevka River. He sent for his family. While he waited for them to arrive, alone in that house, Elena Zakotnova walked home from school in her red coat, and he was ready. After Elena Zakotnova, after watching Kravchenko executed in his place, Chikatilo went quiet. There are no documented victims for the next 3 years. He was still teaching, still being investigated for misconduct with students, still being dismissed and quietly rehired and dismissed again. In early 1981, he lost his position at the mining school. Unable to find further teaching work, the rumors followed him now like a shadow. He took a job as a supply clerk for a raw materials factory in Rostov. It was a gray, unremarkable position. It also required him to travel across the city, across the region, to other cities entirely, access to victims. On September 3rd, 1981, Chikatilo killed again. Her name was Larisa Tkachenko. She was 17 years old, a boarding school runaway sitting alone at a bus stop outside the Rostov Public Library. He approached her. He offered her what she needed. She agreed to walk with him. He led her into a wooded area near the Don River. What happened there was savage beyond ordinary language. Larisa Tkachenko did not survive. Her body was found the following day, covered with leaves and newspaper pages. The forensic psychiatrist, who would later study Chikatilo in depth, Dr. Bukhanovsky, would explain what was happening in moments like these. Chikatilo was a man whose neurology had made ordinary intimacy impossible, and whose psychology had, over years of isolation and shame, constructed a dark and terrible substitute. Violence was not incidental to what he was doing. It was the mechanism. The knife was not a weapon of opportunity. For him, it was the only pathway to something he had never been able to reach any other way. In June 1982, 13-year-old Lubov Biryuk was walking home from a shopping trip in the village of Donskoy when Chikatilo followed her from the road onto a secluded path. Her body was found afterward with injuries that left the investigators struggling to process what they were looking at. She was his third known victim. He killed 7 more times before the year was out. The victims were a mixed group: teenage girls, young women, and children. The presence of male victims confused investigators who had difficulty accepting that one person was responsible for all of it. Cases were not properly connected. Evidence sat in different offices across different jurisdictions. No one was standing far enough back to see the full shape of what was happening. The shape was this: a middle-aged man with glasses was approaching the most vulnerable people in the city, at bus stops, at train stations, in the places where the lonely and the lost tend to gather. Runaways, children, people traveling alone, people that the Soviet state was not designed to look for. He offered them simple things: food, a shortcut, a place to sleep. He led them to the nearest available woodland, and what he did there was something investigators described years later as almost impossible to fully absorb, even for people who'd spent careers working violent crime. The forensic evidence at each scene told a story of extreme, deliberate cruelty. A cruelty that served a specific psychological purpose for him, one that Dr. Buchanovsky would spend years trying to map and articulate. By the end of 1982, there were at least 9 known victims. The Soviet police had almost nothing to show for it. By September 1983, Moscow had run out of patience. A senior detective named Major Mikhail Fedosov was sent from the capital to assume control. He arrived, assessed what the local police had built in the years since Elena Zakotnova's murder, and sent a report back to Moscow that was, by all accounts, devastating in its criticism. The investigation was mismanaged. The cases, clearly the work of one offender, had never been properly unified. Fedosov wrote that they were dealing with a single sadistic killer, operating with a consistent method. He was right about everything except one thing. He did not use the phrase serial killer, because in the Soviet Union officially, that phrase did not exist. Fedosov brought in a specialist. Viktor Burakov was a forensic analyst based in Shakhty, methodical, rigorous, and someone who understood physical evidence in a way that was genuinely rare in Soviet law enforcement. Burakov was appointed to lead the investigation on the ground. The unit they built became known as Operation Forest Strip, named for the wooded areas where most of the bodies had been found. It was, in function if not in name, the Soviet Union's first serial killer task force. Burakov understood immediately that the standard investigative playbook was not going to be enough. The scale of what they were dealing with was beyond anything the Soviet system had been built to handle. The suspect card index would eventually reach 15,000 names. Hundreds of officers were involved across multiple agencies, and the bureaucratic rivalry between the militia and the procurators poisoned coordination at nearly every level. The early investigative methods were, to put it plainly, catastrophic. The police focused first on those with histories of mental illness or prior criminal offenses. A man with learning difficulties was brought in after behaving suspiciously near a streetcar depot. Under prolonged interrogation, he claimed involvement in several of the killings and implicated 4 other men. All 5 were arrested and subjected to sustained, brutal questioning. Over days and weeks, all 5 confessed to crimes they could not describe, couldn't locate, could not connect to a single named victim. The confessions were worthless, but the men stayed in custody. One of them took his own life while detained. And while they sat in those cells, Chikatilo continued to kill. When it became impossible to deny, when new victims appeared, even as the suspects remained locked up, they were released. The investigation pivoted. The focus shifted to Rostov's gay community, who were subjected to harassment and discrimination, grounded in nothing but investigative prejudice. This produced nothing. The investigation pivoted again, now focusing on anyone with a driving license, because the killer was covering vast distances. More than 150,000 people were checked. This also produced nothing. Viktor Burakov understood that what they were doing was broken. And so, in an act that was genuinely unprecedented within Soviet law enforcement, he went entirely outside the system. He approached the Rostov Medical Institute and asked for the help of psychologists and criminal behavior specialists. Most refused. The request existed in completely undefined institutional territory. The USSR had never officially recognized criminal profiling or psychological analysis of offender behavior as legitimate tools of investigation. There was no framework, no protocol, no precedent. But one man agreed. Dr. Alexander Bukhanovsky was a psychiatrist willing to work in the space where the Soviet system had drawn no map. He told Burakov he would build a profile, but he would need to construct a methodology from nothing because nothing like it had ever been attempted here before. 10 days later, Bukhanovsky delivered his findings. He described the killer as likely between 45 and 50 years old, educated, but with a profound history of psychological suffering around his own identity and sense of worth. Someone for whom violence and the suffering of others had become inextricably linked to the only form of release his psychology could access. Bukhanovsky gave this a name: necrosadist. Someone for whom power over another person's final moments was the only thing that worked. The killer, Bukhanovsky said, would be isolated, friendless, with an extremely low sense of self-worth concealed beneath an ordinary surface. He would be someone the world overlooked. It wasn't much, but it was more than they had had before. An inspector named Alexander Zanisovsky was assigned to the transport hubs, bus stations, train stations, where recent victims had last been seen. He operated on a principle he trusted implicitly: killers always return to where they have found success before. Within days of beginning his patrol, Zanisovsky noticed a man, middle-aged, glasses, moving through the bus station in a way that felt deliberate and predatory, watching young women and girls, approaching them, being dismissed, moving on to the next. There was nothing technically criminal in what he was doing, but something about it sat deeply wrong. Zanisovsky approached the man and asked to see his papers. The man was nervous, visibly so. He said he was just bored. He used to be a teacher, he said. That was why he was talking to young girls. His name was Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo. His papers showed he worked freelance for a division connected to the KGB's Department of Internal Affairs. With nothing concrete to hold him on, Zanisovsky returned the papers and let him go. But the feeling would not leave him. He kept watching. Weeks later, he saw him again. The same man, the same black fur hat, the same way of moving through a crowd as though he was reading it. Zanisovsky said afterward, "When I felt it in my guts was when I saw him the second time, weeks later, doing the same thing. I thought, you won't get away from me." He and a colleague followed Chikatilo for an entire day. They watched him approach women on buses and at platforms and in waiting rooms. They watched him be turned away again and again and simply move to the next person. Eventually, Zanisovsky had seen enough. He moved in and made an arrest. In Chikatilo's briefcase, a knife, Vaseline, rope. Under Soviet law, a suspect could only be held for 72 hours without charge. A minor public order offense bought 15 days. During that window, investigators went deep into Chikatilo's past. What they found was disturbing. The pattern of complaints from schools. The incidents with students that institutions had buried rather than report. The abandoned house near the Grushevka River. The pieces were fitting together, and then the forensic results arrived. The evidence recovered from multiple crime scenes had indicated a killer with type AB blood. Chikatilo's blood test came back type A. It did not match. The case collapsed. He was held on the outstanding theft charges, a separate serious matter under Soviet law, and sentenced to a year. He served 3 months He was expelled from the Communist Party, and then he was released. What no one knew, what the Soviet forensic system had no established framework to account for, was that Chikatilo was a genetic rarity known as a non-sequitur. In a small proportion of people, blood type cannot be determined from anything other than a direct blood sample. His blood was type A. But the biological material left at crime scenes told a different story, one that matched him. The science existed to understand this, but it hadn't been applied. And because it hadn't been applied, Chikatilo walked free. For Alexander Zanisovsky, who had trusted his instincts from the very first day, the aftermath was brutal. He was formally demoted for, in the words of his superiors, being overly zealous in the performance of his duties. Chikatilo collected his things and walked back out into the world. From 1985 onwards, the investigation was rebuilt from the ground up. Mikhail Gorbachev had become General Secretary of the Communist Party in March of that year, following the death of Konstantin Chernenko. With him came glasnost and perestroika, the beginning, however cautious, of transparency and structural reform across the Soviet Union. A new senior investigator, Isa Kostoyev, from the KGB Department of Crimes of Special Importance, was assigned to the case. He restructured the operation into 3 focused teams, each covering a key geographic zone. The surveillance net was extraordinary. Undercover officers were placed at every major transport hub. Policewomen dressed as drifters attempted to draw the killer's attention. Hidden cameras were installed in train stations. A volunteer civilian militia was drafted to assist with searches of the woodland areas. One of those civilian volunteers was the killer himself. Chikatilo joined the search effort. He walked through the same forests where he had left his victims, pretending to look for the man responsible. He now had a precise map of where the police were focused and where they were not. And so he adjusted. He moved his crimes. In August 1985, in Moscow, he approached a young woman with learning difficulties near the Domodedovo airport. He offered to walk with her. 2 days later, her body was found in a wooded area not far from her home. The level of violence inflicted upon her was, by this point, characteristic of what investigators had come to expect from this case. And yet it never became easier to process. Less than a month later, he killed again. Another young woman, alone, looking for somewhere to sleep. He offered her lodging. She went with him. She never came back. By 1987, he was killing in cities hundreds of kilometers from Rostov. A 16-year-old boy was lured from a train in Leningrad. His remains would not be discovered for years. Reports arrived from Uzbekistan. 2 murders bearing all the hallmarks of the same offender. The evidence at one scene so disturbing that investigators initially believed an accident had occurred rather than a crime. The distance was not random. It was strategic. He worked as a traveling buyer. He had legitimate business in these cities. He had itineraries and receipts and work records that functioned inadvertently as alibis, built into the ordinary architecture of an unremarkable professional life. Burikov, by this point, had given more of himself to this investigation than can easily be described. He had overseen hundreds of interrogations, the blood testing of tens of thousands of people, the surveillance of every major transport hub in the region. He had watched wrong men confess under pressure. He had watched innocent lives destroyed. He had watched the body count climb through the 20s, through the 30s, past 40. In an act of genuine desperation and in genuine intellectual courage, he went to Novocherkassk prison's death row to interview a convicted serial killer named Anatoly Slivko, who was awaiting execution for the murders of 7 victims. Burakov wanted insight from the inside into how someone with this profile thinks, how they maintain an ordinary life among ordinary people without triggering alarm, how they sustain the performance of normalcy across years and decades. Slivko, with nothing left to lose, was candid. He described the deliberate construction of a face that the world wants to see, the careful management of how one appears to neighbors, colleagues, family. He described invisibility not as absence, but as an ongoing, calculated act. The man Burakov was hunting had been performing that invisibility for over a decade. From 1988 onwards, something in Chikatilo's behavior shifted. His victims were now predominantly young boys. The killings were happening in more public locations, a botanical garden, a beach, outside a cinema. The risk of being seen was dramatically higher than it had been in the early years. The interval between crimes was shortening. What the forensic psychology literature suggests about moments like these is that the compulsion had intensified beyond the killer's own ability to manage it. The behavior that had once delivered a temporary release was now demanding more frequently, and at greater risk. He was not pulling back. He was accelerating. In 1990 alone, he killed 9 times. On November 6, 1990, at a remote station called Don Lesko's, Chikatilo committed what would be his final crime. A 22-year-old woman named Svetlana Korostik was drawn into the surrounding woodland. Her body was found 7 days later. As Chikatilo walked back toward the station afterward, disheveled, a bandage on an injured hand, visibly unsettled, he passed a police sergeant named Igor Rybov on the platform. Rybov asked to see his papers. He noted something odd, but the train arrived, and there were no solid grounds to detain him, so Chikatilo was allowed to board. Rybov filed a report. When Svetlana Korostik's body was found days later, someone remembered that report. Investigators went back through the files, looking for anyone who had been noted behaving strangely near a recent crime scene. One name surfaced: Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo, the same name Alexander Zanisovsky had written down 6 years before. Investigators cross-referenced Chikatilo's work travel records against the dates and locations of known murders. Killing after killing, he had been in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. The pattern was undeniable. On November 20th, 1990, Chikatilo left work early to have his injured hand examined. He went for provisions. 3 plainclothed officers who had been watching him approached him on the street. He was carrying a briefcase. Inside it, a knife, Vaseline, rope, the same 3 items he had been carrying when Zanisovsky arrested him in 1984. He was taken into custody without a word. The arrest was filmed. He sat in the car in silence. At the Department of Internal Affairs, officers went immediately to search his home and found evidence that confirmed the scale of what they were dealing with. He was photographed, processed, and placed in isolation. What followed was weeks of silence. Chikatilo denied everything. He wrote letters to the prosecutor general, philosophical, evasive, circling the truth without landing on it. One read in part, "I felt a kind of madness and ungovernability in perverted sexual acts. I couldn't control my actions because, From childhood, I was unable to realize myself as a real man and a complete human being. Not a confession, but not a denial either. Another letter arrived. It never entered my mind to conceal anything from the investigation. Everything which I have done makes me shudder. I only feel gratitude to the investigating bodies for having captured me. Still nothing actionable. Isa Kostoyev was getting nowhere. Burakov made a decision. He called Dr. Bukhanovsky. He asked Bukhanovsky to speak to Chikatilo. Not as a threat, not as an interrogator, but as a scientist who wanted to understand. There was one condition. Whatever Bukhanovsky learned in those conversations couldn't be used as evidence in court. Bukhanovsky agreed. On November 30th, 1990, Dr. Alexander Bukhanovsky sat across from Andrei Chikatilo and said something no one in law enforcement had thought to say. He told Chikatilo that his behavior had roots in genuine psychological illness, that what had happened to him was, in some deep and complex way, the product of a damaged psychology that no one had ever helped him understand, that his case was scientifically unique, that it mattered, that it was worth studying. He told Chikatilo, in other words, that he was interesting. To a man who had spent his entire life being ridiculed, overlooked, and dismissed, a man of real intelligence trapped inside a life of humiliation. The idea that someone found him worthy of serious attention was, apparently, impossible to resist. Bukhanovsky arranged for Chikatilo's wife to come in. For the first time since his arrest, Chikatilo broke. He wept. He was shown the psychological profile that Bukhanovsky had written years earlier, the detailed portrait of the killer they had been hunting. And he said quietly, "Yes, it's me." On December 5th, 1990, he confessed in full. The police had attributed 36 murders to the forest strip killer. Chikatilo told them they had it wrong. He had committed 56. Once he started talking, he could not stop. He described each killing with a cold precision that shook every officer in the room. He spoke about his methodology. There's the transport hubs, the promises, the reading of vulnerability in a crowd. He explained why he targeted the eyes of his victims. He explained the cannibalism. He described what he felt in those moments in the woods. He told them that once they were away from the open, he began to shake. He said it was like a fever. He led investigators to murder sites they had never found, to remains that had been in the ground for years. As officers recovered what had been left of each victim, Chikatilo stood watching, expressionless. One of the investigators present described those moments as the most haunting of the entire 12-year investigation. The question that Dr. Bukhanovsky addressed at length in his analysis, how a man with this compulsion remained functional, employed, married, and free for over a decade, comes down to this. Chikatilo did not look like the thing he was. He looked like every other gray, middle-aged Soviet bureaucrat commuting between cities on business he had receipts for. He was the unremarkable background of daily life. He was the man no one looked at twice. His wife Faina said she had no idea. Investigators challenged her. She was firm. She said that if she had known, she would have done something to stop it. Investigators noted that Chikatilo appeared to be genuinely afraid of his wife, that he shrank from her when she raised her voice. It is possible she is telling the truth. It is possible she simply never had cause to look at the man she had married and ask what was underneath. On April 14th, 1992, The trial of Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo began. It was one of the first major criminal trials in post-Soviet Russia. The USSR had been formally dissolved on December the 26th, 1991. A country was rebuilding its legal identity in real time. And this case, this man, this accumulated weight of loss, was sitting at the center of that reckoning. The courtroom was full. 200 people packed into the public gallery. The bereaved, the surviving relatives of more than 50 murdered human beings. The tension was so high that nurses distributed sedatives. The air in the room smelled of valerian drops. Andrei Chikatilo stood in a metal cage, not to prevent him from escaping, to prevent the people in that room from reaching him. Judge Leonid Akubzhanov presided, reading the charges alone from more than 200 case files took 2 full days. The nature of what was described was so extreme that people fainted in the gallery. Guards had to be stood down and replaced when they were overwhelmed by what they were hearing. Chikatilo's behavior throughout the trial was, by most accounts, deliberately theatrical. He sang. He spoke in incoherent rambles. He gave long, self-pitying speeches about persecution, about the mockery he had endured, the failures at work, the constant travel, the loneliness. He shouted from the cage. He made a display of himself that many observers interpreted as a calculated effort to appear mentally unfit for trial. The judge was not persuaded. When Akubzhanov addressed him directly, when he pressed Chikatilo to explain, as a human being, how he had done what he had done, Chikatilo had no answer that made sense. He called himself a crazed wolf, a wild animal. He said he knew he had to be destroyed. He said he was a mistake of nature. The families who testified did not speak in prepared statements. They spoke from the rawest place grief has. Lyakova, whose 10-year-old son Alexei had been taken, said, "I hope he dies the most horrible death, like my son died." Paulina Istina, whose daughter had been taken from her, "Why bother trying him at all? Every day we go through it again. Every day it still doesn't make sense. How can you do that to a person? How is it even possible?" Judge Akubzhanov, in what became one of the most memorable moments of the entire proceedings, directly confronted Chikatilo with the facts of what he had done and demanded that he explain how any human being, for one moment of gratification, could justify taking the life of a child. Chikatilo had no answer. In October 1992, Judge Akubzhanov read the verdict. It was 330 pages long. His voice broke as he delivered it. Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo was found guilty of 52 of the 53 counts of murder. His victims included 21 boys aged between the ages of 8 and 16, 14 girls between the ages of 9 and 17, and 17 women aged 18 and older. His crimes had spanned 12 years, from Elena Zakotnova in 1978 to Svetlana Korostik in 1990, across southern Russia, Ukraine, and Uzbekistan. Each count of guilty came with a separate death sentence. The courtroom erupted in applause. From inside the cage, Chikatilo screamed. He called the judge a swindler. He demanded to see the evidence. He said he hadn't confessed to anything. This from a man who had led investigators to unmarked graves. He was removed from the courtroom. The trial was over. On February 14th, 1994, Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo was taken from his cell. Every appeal had been exhausted. Russian President Boris Yeltsin had personally refused the final petition for clemency. He was executed by a single gunshot. He was 57 years old. The investigators who spent a decade hunting him were left to deal with the aftermath in whatever private way they could. Viktor Burikov had poured the better part of his adult professional life into this case. One detective on the team, exposed to crime scene after crime scene across too many years, began to hallucinate that he himself was the killer. Another officer spent more than a decade in a state of sustained paranoia, unable to board public transport without wondering whether the person beside him was the man he could not catch. For Alexander Zanisovsky, the inspector who had arrested Chikatilo in 1984, been punished for it, and then watched 52 more people die in the years that followed, the eventual vindication was hollow. I was very mad indeed. How can you not be mad when so many more women and children died? Alexander Zanisovsky, Dr. Alexander Bukhanovsky, the psychiatrist who had built a profiling methodology from nothing in a system that denied such a methodology needed to exist, and who had ultimately been the one to unlock Chikatilo's confession, was later formally honored by Moscow for his contributions to the investigation. He went on to become one of the most respected criminal psychologists in post-Soviet Russia. The work he built in that investigation became the foundation for everything that followed. Alexander Kravchenko, 25 years old, wrongly convicted, wrongly executed, was posthumously exonerated by Russia's Supreme Court in 1991. His sentence was formally rescinded. It was too late for him by 31 years. The case of Andrei Chikatilo is studied globally, not simply as a chronicle of extraordinary violence, but as a forensic and institutional failure. A study in what happens when a state refuses to name the thing in front of it. The Soviet refusal to acknowledge that a serial killer could operate within its borders did not prevent one from doing so. It simply protected him. The bureaucratic rivalry between law enforcement agencies made catching him effectively impossible. The forensic blind spot around how his body processed biological evidence cost years and lives. Every institutional failure compounded the last. Every system that values the performance of order above the reality of disorder produces the same outcome. The thing it refuses to see grows in the space of that refusal. Chikatilo himself said it in the interview he gave on death row, in his usual evasive, self-dramatizing way. I am asked to describe how it all happened. But what can I explain? The question behind that question was not about mechanics. It was about the gap between what he appeared to be, an ordinary, forgettable man going about an ordinary, forgettable life, and what he was doing in the dark. That gap is what this case is really about. Not just Andrei Chikatilo, not just the Soviet Union, the gap between the face a person shows the world and the one they show no one. 52 people encountered what was on the other side of that face. 21 boys, 14 girls, 17 women, human beings with names, with families who carried them, with futures that were taken from them in a woodland clearing in the gray outskirts of a city that didn't know they were gone. They deserve to be remembered, not as victims, not as evidence, as people. Elena, Larissa, Lyubov, Svetlana, and 48 more.